Well, hello viewers. Today we have a 2007 Tacoma with a 4-cylinder engine. Can't remember what displacement that is. 2.7 or something like that. Yes, 2.7. And it has a knock in it. To me it sounds like a bottom end noise, connecting rod knock. So I start with a network code scan of the vehicle to see if there's any underlying issues before we might end up doing some engine work here, and I see some evaporative emission system codes for incorrect purge flow, gross leak, and an immobilizer code. Too low voltage in the battery, tire pressure sensors, seat position sensors, seat buckle switch. And nothing has been recently cleared because all the maintenance monitors are running past. So that's odd. How could all the maintenance monitors be running past if it's got these evap codes? Oh well, that's secondary. I want to go into the engine control computer and see if we have the capability to kill cylinders individually, like shorting out spark plug wires, but this is COP ignition. System tests. No. Actuator tests. Data display. Check mode. Really? Read write VIN. Troubleshooter. Reset memory. Won't be under actuator tests. So maybe. Fuel cut 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so we're going to use this process to try and turn off injectors 1, 2, 3, and 4 individually, see if we can hear the pitch of that knock diminish with killing of an injector. I'll let you listen to the knock first off. Well, I've checked the oil level and quality, and it's full and it looks reasonably clean. You know, the person looks after this thing pretty good. It's got 301,000 kilometers on it, but that's not uncommon for these vehicles. They go between 3 and 500k. So we're going to start this up and listen to the noise. So at an idle it sounds fairly quiet, but it's when you... Well, there's a bit of a knock there. And it's cold right now. It's only been running for about 2 minutes, 3 minutes. So I'm going to rev the engine up and you're going to hear this noise. I hear a phone ringing. So we're going to use the scanner to individually kill injectors and see if the knock diminishes. It actually sounds worse when we kill injector 1. So let's try fuel cut number 2. Number 2 doesn't make a difference. Let's try number 3. Numbers 3 seems to make a difference. Let's try number 4. honestly think it's number 3, although it's hard to tell. I'm going to repeat the test at a higher RPM. So I'm going to try this from in the cab. I got to hold the throttle down. So I actually think now it's number 1 cylinder, because it seems to diminish completely when I kill number 1 cylinder. Now it's got a double knock when I kill number 1 cylinder. But it definitely seems to be related to number 1. So I think we're going to end up pulling this engine, because I don't think pulling the pan off is a good choice. It has timing chain rattle when you first start it cold, so we're going to remove the engine and do a disassembly to see what's going on. So disconnect the negative battery cable, put it off to the side, remove the upper plastic trim on the radiator shroud with the push pins, and remove the fan blade, viscous clutch assembly, 4 12mm nuts. I usually find it easier to do that with the serpentine belt still on, and then the 2 10mm nuts or bolts that hold the shroud to the fan or to the rad. Tilt the shroud towards the engine and pull the viscous clutch out. Now we're going to take the serpentine belt off and this pulley. Now I'm bagging all the parts because I have no idea how long this is going to be apart. So it's a good idea, unless you're super familiar with everything, to bag and tag all of the components, because it could be a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks before this goes back together, and it'll be much easier to discern where all these nuts and bolts go. This thing has an oil leak on the passenger side timing cover area. It looks like it's coming from in here. You see oil on that bolt there. I don't know if that's a timing solenoid or what. This does have a timing chain rattle when you start it cold too, so it's likely going to need timing components, but that's secondary. So I'm currently draining the radiator, and I was contemplating removing the rad, although there's a fair amount of room here. There's about a foot in front of the engine. So I might consider leaving it in there, because these captured nuts in the rad here are spinning, or going to spin. I tried the top one here, accessible through the grill here. You can see that nut just above the AC pipe, or that bolt. So I think I'm just going to leave the rad in there, take the hoses off. Being a standard, the engine has to come forward about 5-6 inches before it can come up. So if it was an automatic, I definitely have no problem taking it out. I think it'll work though. So next I removed the alternator, the electrical wires, connector, and 2 fasteners, and the power steering pump assembly. I took the battery right out so it would give me some place to set the power steering pump. Now the AC compressor needs to be unbolted from the engine, and it looks like we can just let it sit on the subframe down there. The AC pipes are attached to the bottom of the engine, so we'll have to undo that brace down there right below the harmonic balancer. And I'm going to attempt to take the wiring harness off the engine. It looks like it can be disconnected semi-easily and leave it in the engine bay. Otherwise it goes into through the firewall and into the cab, and I'm not sure if it's easier to undo it from inside and leave the harness on the engine, but eventually it's going to have to be disconnected from the engine anyway, so might as well take it off in the car if possible. So you must remove the 12mm bolts that hold the AC compressor to the AC compressor bracket, because there are several bolts under the bracket. You can't get them unless you get the compressor out of the way. So I've got the compressor detached from the engine. I've got the battery cables detached from the body, ground cable from the strut tower, positive cable and negative cable from the fender. So we can leave them on there. Take the heater hoses off at the heater core carefully. Leave the heater hoses attached to the engine. The wiring harness all unclipped so far. There may be a ground or something attached to the back, but this is the entire wiring harness here. Oh, there's one bracket going down to the oil, or one connector going down to the oil pressure switch still I'm going to get from underneath. Air injection pump disconnect. I got to disconnect this hose here. And then we're ready to go down, undo the motor mounts and bell housing bolts. There's all the bell housing bolts out. Starter removed, ground cable off. I ended up taking the battery cable off. I think it's going to need a starter because the feed stud going into the starter cracked. No matter how much I tried not to spin it, it was corroded. Now the exhaust nuts are spinning on top of the exhaust pipe there. I'm not sure what kind of nut it is. I'm going to get it there with a mirror and look. You see the motor mounts. That's it, basically the exhaust and the motor mounts, and we're ready to lift this thing out of here. So there's the motor mounts out, exhaust disconnected, bell housing bolts out. Should be ready to lift it up. I need to lift it up about a half an inch, maybe an inch and a half, to clear this cross member here. There's enough room above the tranny, I think, to do that. I don't really want to take the transmission out separate. Well, let's give her a try. So the engine will come out with the rad in, even though it's a standard. As I said, you have to pull the engine forward about roughly 5 inches to clear the flywheel and clutch housing and input shaft on the transmission. I could have put a piece of cardboard in front of the rad, but I was pretty careful lifting it up. But the back of the engine, there are 2 ground studs, ground bolts that you pretty much can't get to unless you're lifting the engine. So raise it up a few inches and pull it forward a couple of inches, and then you can take these 2 12mm headed bolts out. The harness is clipped down here and here as well, so you can undo this clip. This clip popped off. There's a knock sensor connector and a temp sensor connector that I did not see, and it's nearly impossible to get to them because they're above the bell housing. I could not release that connector. I tried from underneath. I tried from the top and I couldn't get my hands in there, so I'll cut and splice these 2 wires. It'll be easy to plug it back in on the way in, but it's not so easy to disconnect it. Even now I can't get it to release because these connectors are full of sand and grit. So we're going to mount this on a stand, pull the flywheel off of it and clutch housing off of it. Clutch was replaced already. The frame's been done on this truck under warranty. So that's why it's worth fixing this thing. And we'll put it on an engine stand and flip it upside down. I've already drained the oil out of it. So here's the lower oil pan off, and look and behold, we have some aluminum shavings. Well, let's see if we can figure out where that came from. There's a piece on the focus. Anyways, looks like Babbitt from there, not Babbitt, looks like material from the bearings. Let's pull the upper oil pan off and see if we can see any one specific problem. So I decided to go after number 1 because that was the one it seemed to point to, and there you go. Number 1 rod bearing has spun. So the rod is damaged, the crank is scored. That's just number 1, so it's going to need a complete teardown, crank regrind, at least one connecting rod. Yeah, that's definitely spun in the rod cap is spun. You can see the ear is broken off. Let's have a look at a couple more. So none of the other bearings had spun, but this is the upper bearing half from number 2, and you can see it's not far from failing either. It's starting to fatigue or shed. The other ones aren't bad. That's number 4, upper and lower. So I'm going to discuss this with the customer and see if he wants to proceed. We're going to have to pull the head, timing chain, guides. Who knows where all that aluminum is situated now from these bearings. Well, I guess there'll be a part 2.